We're good? All right. Hi. Two things before we get started. I'm not feeling great today. Two, I realize I am the thing between you and lunch. So we're going to do this. Let's start back here. My talk is about cognitive bias during incident response, fallacies and problems that you introduce unknowingly. My name is Dru Streicher. I'm from Cleveland. So hello, Cleveland. These amps go to 11. All right. I'm a security analyst for Sherwin-Williams. My main job description is I find bad things in logs. I am an advocate for open source, and I don't use the term Linux hippie. I use the term open source punk rocker because it's more middle finger. I collect vinyl records and other antiquated technology. So let's talk about what cognitive bias is. This is the Wikipedia definition. It's got lots of really nice fancy words in there, and I think it's a really good definition. But what cognitive bias really is are fallacies and things that you introduce without knowing them. You know, most people go into a situation and they make a judgment on something, but what they're not accounting for is the influences and streams of data and things that go into that judgment. And if you don't understand that and you don't recognize that some of that can be biased, it clouds your judgment and your thinking. This is especially problematic when you're dealing with an incident response where stakes are high and it's stressful and there's a lot going on. So Wikipedia has, and I think there's people who study this, they have a list of like, I want to say it's like 30 to 40 actual defined cognitive biased things, and there are things like confirmation bias and influential bias. So these are actually like defined and laid out. So I've decided to make my own because why wouldn't you do that? So the first one that I came up with is what I call prepper bias, and I like these shows where like the guys build. They like dig out a hole in their garage and they've got like 6 months of food and ammunition and they're going to survive the army apocalypse. And like the zombies will come and they'll be okay. And what I think is interesting about this is it creates a self-repeating cycle that at some point, if you don't, like you have all this because you want to be prepared, and if nothing happens, you look pretty silly. So you kind of are looking for something to happen. You kind of secretly want that. And so, in our example, we've got 6 months of food, 50 gallons of water, 20,000 rounds of ammo, and a gold bar buried in my backyard. This is going to look pretty silly if nothing happens, right? So when we look at that in a security context, we do the same thing on a lot of our security programs. We have a staff, we've got 50 tools, we've got all this thing, and if nothing happens, we're going to look pretty silly. How are we going to explain to the C-level, like, yeah, you just spent $1 million in budget last year and nothing happened? And there, it's always the question of return on investment, and you're trying to prove a falsehood. You're trying to prove that nothing happened, which is really hard to do. And you're also showing value if nothing happens, which is very problematic. So how this kind of plays into incident response is if you go looking for bad things, you are going to find them. And if you look at logs all day, you are kind of going to be a little happy when you find things. And that's a little strange reaction because you're looking at something that's very bad, something that's very impactful to the company and your job. But there is a certain amount of joy because you've literally been looking at logs for days and something comes up and you're like, yay, my job has meaning. It's not pointless. I'm not just pushing that rock up the hill. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the sky is falling, and that doesn't mean that every single thing that you see is bad. I think the main thing about incident response is that you want to remain critical, and you want to look at the data in front of you, and you want to remain calm. What I'm going to do in this talk is kind of lay out 3 bias that I see, what they are, and then later in the talk we're going to go back and say, how can we fix these? So the second one is called Gestalt. I have a degree in art history, which is completely useless. But I know words like gestalt, and gestalt is an idea that if you put 4 squares next to each other and you put them in close enough proximity that your eye will be tricked into believing that they are one square. And this is a very interesting thing that happens within incident response. I know that I have caught myself doing this, and I've caught others doing it. So a little story, because everyone likes stories. I've worked with, at Sherwin-Williams, we have something called the Professional Apprentice Association. And what these are is they're college kids that come in, and we teach them everything we can. And I was working with one, looking at logs, looking at attacks, and he made a classic cognitive bias error that I think that I've run into myself, I know I've done, and it just kind of called out to me this kind of situation. And it looks something like this. You get this is an Apache log, you get a request for WP login.php, it returns a 200. Anyone know what that is? Right, there we go, a WordPress login page. So you could get administrative credentials, do a bunch of bad things. So we looked at the server itself, and he ran a vulnerability scan on it, came back with, oh no, super high mega critical SQL injection. So you have a log and you have a vulnerability, that means it's totally screwed, right? And this is one of those things where we get into the idea of we want to apply Occam's razor, which is the simplest explanation is always the best. And we go, oh, look, we saw this log that said that somebody was attacking us, and we have a vulnerability. Let's put those squares really close together so they make one big square that shows that we have had compromise. And Occam's razor is an interesting problem, but there's also something that exists in the medical community called Hickman's dictum, and I really like this. And it states that patients can have as many diseases as they damn well want. And this is awesome for vulnerability because what we want to do is we want to apply this idea of the simplest explanation is always the best. But you can have a WordPress that has SQL injection. You can have multiple vulnerabilities, but that doesn't mean that that equals a compromise. So what I stress to a lot of these young college students is these 2 questions are what you're trying to answer, which is this server vulnerable to this particular attack that you are seeing, and was this attack successful? Another thing that there is a difference between having a vulnerability and having an exploitable vulnerability. If I have conditions that exist for a certain vulnerability to take place, but I have compensating controls, or I have administered something in a manner that cannot be exploitable, then it's not really a concern. So this is my 3rd bias example, and I could probably come up with a bunch of these if I really wanted to, but you know, I'm sure you guys don't want to hear me ramble for hours. This is one I call the visibility problem, and I'm going to pick here a little bit on breaking SSL, and I wholeheartedly believe that you should break SSL in certain places, and I'm just using this as an example. And it goes something like this. Somebody talks to a vendor, somebody comes back from a convention, somebody reads a blog post and it says, you totally need to break SSL so that you can see your proxy logs. You have no idea the bad things that are going out of your logs. It's horrible. You're going to find all this bad stuff. You need to break it. You got to get that visibility. All right, stay with me. So we get about 1.5 million proxy events per hour. We're a pretty big company. 52% of those are HTTPS, means that we would have to break SSL to understand what is in the contents of those logs. 48% of those would be in the clear, which would be something that we could read no problem. And let's just say that we can look at 5 of these events per day. Now, if we break SSL, we can look at 5 of them a day. And I would argue that you could probably even not look at 5 a day because now you're dealing with a larger volume of noise. Whereas if you're looking at 48% of the traffic, and that's what you're looking at. If you add that other stuff in, it's just noise. So I would say that you're probably less efficient. So in this, we've talked about we're looking for visibility. We want to get the most out of our traffic and see what's going on our network, but you can actually lose visibility by taking this approach. The other thing is, don't confuse resources, because if you have a SOC of 5 people and they can only do that amount of work, that's the amount of work that they can do. You can make that more efficient, you can add automation, but there is a point at which that becomes destructive when you're adding so much noise to the environment and you're trying to bring your program to a place that it's not. I also don't confuse tools with productivity. I think the speaker that spoke before me listed a bunch of great tools, and I think he had a lot of really, really good things to say. And he was talking a lot about the administration of them, the cost versus the reward. And I think that's a big thing. Like in security, we go crazy with tools, and every vendor out here will sell you something. And what we fail to understand is that every new tool that we put in, somebody has to administer that. So if you have a staff of 5 people, that means that you're going to have to administer that tool, which means that you have a staff of 4 people. And then if you add another tool and another tool and another tool, this becomes to the point that all you're doing is administering security tools, and you're not dealing with the outcomes of them, be it alerts, be it understanding, be it visibility on your network in this case. So we're screwed, right? Right? Let's go home. I got 50 gallons of water. So what I think the biggest takeaway from this should be that there are things that you do that are illogical that you don't realize that you are doing. So to combat those, we need to employ certain techniques. And the big thing is just understanding that there are bias. So if I have looked at 1,000 SQL injections in the last week, going into the next SQL injection, I'm going to have that bias. If 1,000 of those were unsuccessful, I'm going to assume that the next one is unsuccessful as well. And that can cloud my judgment. I think understanding that bias and acknowledging it is probably the first and probably the biggest, most important thing to do. So let's get into the prepper bias. I think the strongest thing for this is having an incident plan. It is also understanding and escalating things on up. So people talk a lot about an incident response plan. You actually want to write it down. You want to have it written, laid out. Much like the gentleman before me said, like writing an IR plan in the middle of IR is a really bad idea. And you want to practice it. You want to go through tabletops. You need to understand, whose job it is to do this and whose job it is to do this. When do you call so-and-so? When do the lawyers come in? And you want to escalate. You want to go from something that looks a little weird, and you want to walk it through a process. You don't want to go from something looks a little weird, oh my God, we're going to be on Krebs. Because that is a giant leap. And the evidence probably isn't there for that. And I think a big part of the incident response is understanding who does what. And I think that you need to have somebody that is just in charge of following the process and making sure that that the process is followed. And this eliminates a lot of the prepper bias, because your first analyst that looks at it may see a log and say, oh my God, this is horrible, and we enter that prepper bias where it's like, this is horrible. I'm so glad that we found this. And they may not be seeing the whole picture, and it needs to be validated and worked through a process. They're probably biased, so you need to bring in outside sources that may have different biases to work together. So what I mean by this is, as far as escalation is, we'll call it level 1, you can call it whatever you want. And it's kind of, you see a log, an email, an administrator. Administrators are great for knowing when systems don't look right. So, hey, it's really weird, my temp partition is full. Like, that's weird, right? So they bring this to you, or you see something in a log, or even, like you're talking with somebody and my account doesn't seem to work. So it is a security event. And the question that you're trying to answer here is this thing malicious? Is this whatever, is it malicious? If it is, then you bring it up to level 2. And this is what we would consider, what you're looking for is, does this fall into the next criteria of, is this a security investigation? And this falls back to was this device vulnerable to the attack, and was this attack successful? And this can be, a variety of different things from, social engineering, credential harvesting, to full attacks on, a server or whatever. If it was successful, what you have is an investigation. Then you're looking at compromise. And compromise is defined as unauthorized people or persons gaining access to a system. And it's pretty straightforward. A good example of this would be like, your WordPress server gets popped, and you see that www data is now running as a administrator root account. That's obviously compromised and elevated privileges. So we get to the final and the worst, which is a security breach. And this is when unauthorized individuals exfiltrate data out. And you can walk through security response, IR response, and not get to this level. It's, just because you start off with 1 doesn't mean you have to get to 4. And hopefully you won't get to 4, because it is where, it gets real. So at each step during this, you want to validate each other's work. You want to make sure that, the initial analyst who looked at it, yeah, that makes sense. That is what we're seeing too. And this comes into different areas. I had a situation where I had a TCP outbound connection that I couldn't explain, and I was asked to investigate whether the operating system itself had been compromised. And I could find no evidence that the operating system itself could be compromised, yet one of my associates who studies weblogs looked at the weblogs and totally found out what was causing the TCP connection. What I mean by this is you want to check each other's work. You don't want to work in silos. Everyone has little things that they're good at, and this is another form of bias that you want to, it's a good thing in many regards, because somebody may be good at weblogs and somebody may be good at system logs. That's definitely something you want to use to your advantage, and let the subject matter be the experts. When you have somebody that is really good at weblogs, don't try and reinvent the wheel, just let them do it. And then validate their findings. Make sure that it makes sense, that it seems logical, and that the data is there to provide support to it. Because ultimately the data is the most important thing. The data does not lie. The data tells you what happens. You want to keep calm, and this is a big thing because you get into a high-pressure situation and your mind starts racing, you start putting 2 and 2 together, and sometimes you come up with 5, sometimes you come up with 3. You want to remain calm, and you want to remain skeptical to the point until the data shows you otherwise. A lot of times people try and write incident response plans to be exactly like, if we are DDoSed, this is the plan that we follow. If we have compromised credentials from a spearfish of our CEO, we follow this plan. And unfortunately, that doesn't work in many situations, because can you guys think of every single way that you're going to be attacked? And if you can, then you can write an incident response plan. But I know I can't. So what I'm looking for is a broad set of guidelines that I can adapt quickly to the situation that I need. So we get back to the logs. Like I said, the logs don't lie. The logs are the record of the event, and this is how we combat the Gestalt problem. We are looking at a record of something that happened on a system. It is not up for interpretation as far as what happened because we have that laid out. And rarely in incident response do the logs provide the closure that everyone's looking for. You're rarely ever going to see bad guy logged in and did this bad thing. It's usually stringing multiple logs together. It's usually stringing the holes together, the things that you don't see. And most of the times you just don't have the logs. And you rarely ever get to a situation where you're like, man, I had way too many logs. If I didn't have all these logs, this would be so much easier. Usually what you have is a situation where I can prove A, I can prove B, and then D happens, and I don't know what happened in C. I don't know what happened in E. And then we get into the visibility problem. So when do we decrypt SSL to get that good visibility on our network? And I think it starts off with what do you have available? And be honest, like if you have 5 guys in your security department, you guys can do the work of 5 guys. If you have 10 people in your security department, that's the amount of work that you can do. And if you're only able to do a very, very little, do it, but recognize that that's all you can do, and make sure that it's the best thing that you can do. And we throw around this term risk-based assessment, risk-based management, and I think this is a great place where that comes into play. If all you can look at is 5 events, make sure they are the most 5 important events within your environment. So how do you find that? Because if you go to your management, if you go to your CEO and you say, hey, we can look at 5 events today, what do you think the most important events that we should look at are? You're going to get deer in the headlights. And they're going to be like, security, bad things, go, synergies, PowerPoint, give me a pie chart, I don't know. So a lot of it is, what is the worst thing for your company? Is it, a full-scale breach? Is it, a loss of PII? Is it the fact that your industrial formulations are now in China being sold for $2 less than you made it? Do you not want to see your CEO making the perp walk? Like whatever that thing is, find out what that is. And people may not know. You may not be able to tell. You may not be able to go to your management and your CEO level and say, "Are you guys concerned about whale fishing?" They're not going to know what you're talking about. But if you say to them, "Would it be really bad if your credentials were used to transfer $1 million wire fund to the Ukraine?" They're probably going to understand that. And if that is a concern for them, then you can look for that kind of thing. And your worst case scenario, whatever that is probably the highest risk. There are fancy formulas and charts for calculating risk, but if you actually sit down and talk to the people who have to evaluate that thing, they're going to tell you what keeps them up at night. And that's probably the highest risk. And it also may or may not be the coolest in terms of security. I mean, I think everyone wants to work on, the latest, greatest new malware and reverse engineering and all of that, but something as simple as a bug that has been around for 10 years may be the thing that you're looking for. So figure out what that is, and then go stop it. It's pretty easy, right? That's really all I have. So long, and thanks for the tofu. Does anyone have any questions? Rude remarks? Awesome. Can we give a thanks to all the people that put this together? Because these guys are awesome, and they're giving up their Saturday to do this.